Good afternoon, everyone. We are the group 11 and we are going to talk about the skin. So, the skin, in other words, if we hear the word skin, the first thing that would come into our minds is that it is the largest organ in the body, which is technically true. The skin is the largest single organ of the body that typically accounting for 15% to 20% of total body weight, and in adults presenting a 1.5 to 2 meters squared of surface to the external environment. The skin is also known as the integument or the integumentum, which means covering or cutaneous layer, where the skin is composed of the epidermis or an epithelial layer of ectodermal origin, and the dermis, a layer of mesodermal connective tissue at the irregular junction between the dermis and epidermis projection, called the dermal papillae. Dermal papillae is an interdigitate with invaginating epidermal ridges to strengthen adhesion of the two layers, which is the epidermis and the dermis. Later on, there would be a visual representation of that. Next is that epidermal derivatives includes the hair, nails, and sebaceous and sweat glands. Beneath the dermis lies is the subcutaneous tissue or the hypodermis. Hypo means under, plasderma means skin, or they are the loose connective tissue layer usually containing pads of adipocytes. So the skin have specific function which fall into several broad categories. First is the protective. This is the most important function of the skin because it is the reason to form a barrier between the organism and the environment, where it provides a physical barrier against thermal and mechanical insults such as friction and against most potential pathogens and other material. The next one is the sensory. Our skin contain a specialized sensory nerve structures that possible for detection of touch or to detect touch, surface temperature, and pain. Sensory, which means there are many types of sensory receptors that will allow the skin to constantly monitor the environment, and various skin mechanoreceptors that will help to regulate the body's interaction with physical objects. Number 3 is they are possible for thermoregulatory. The skin regulates body temperature with its blood supply, and the skin assists in homeostasis. So therefore, they are for thermoregulatory, where a constant body temperature is normally or easily maintained thanks to the skin's insulating components. Example of that insulating components are the fatty layer, the hair on the head, and its mechanism for accelerating heat loss. Acceleration of heat loss means there would be sweat production and such. Number 4 is specific function would be the metabolic. Cells of skin synthesizes vitamin D3, which is needed in calcium metabolism and proper bone formation through the local action of UV light on vitamin precursors. So, they are metabolic because they are possible for synthesization of the vitamin D3, which will be possible that can be needed when calcium metabolism and for bone formation. Next is for sexual signaling, such as pigmentation in hair, are visual indicators of health involved in attraction between the sexes in all vertebrate species, including humans. So many features of skin, such as the hair, pigmentation, can also be a possible function for skin through sexual signaling. Next is that the dermal epidermal interdigitations are of the peg and socket variety in most skin, but they occur as well-formed ridges and grooves in the thick skin of the palms and soles, which is more subject to friction. These ridges and the intervening sulci form distinctive patterns unique for each individual, appearing as combination of loops, arches, and whorls called the dermatoglyphs, or also known as the fingerprints and footprints. So therefore, this is like a trivia. The most unique characteristic of our skin, or the most pinaka-unique for each individual with distinctive patterns, is that their fingerprints and footprints, which can be also seen in our skin. So this picture is just a representation of what fingerprints looks like and how are they different from each other, or the patterns they have for a specific person. There would be a distinctive pattern or unique for each individual. They are also known as dermatoglyphs. So first, we are going to tackle about the ectodermal, or the outermost layer of the skin, the epidermis. So the epidermis consists mainly of a stratified squamous keratinized epithelium composed of cells called keratinocytes. So when you hear the word epidermis, it would always be followed by the word cells, or composed of cells called the keratinocytes. There are also 3 much less abundant epidermal cell types. So ang aton nga epidermis have epidermal cell types, pigment-producing melanocytes. They will be introduced to you later on because mine is just a parang introductory part. Next is the antigen-presenting Langerhans cells and the tactile epithelial cells called Merkel cells. So that the 3 less abundant epidermal cell types is the melanocytes. If you heard the word melanocyte, they are common for pigment producing. Antigen presenting, or the Langerhans cells, antigen presenting, or the APCs, antigen presenting cells, and the tactile epithelial cells called the Merkel cells. So the epidermis forms the major distinction between thick skin found on the palms and soles and thin skin found elsewhere on the body. The designation thick and thin refer to the thickness of the epidermal layer, which alone varies from 75 to 150 nanometer for thin skin, from 400 to 1,400 nanometer, or 1.4 millimeter for thick skin. The total skin thickness, or the epidermal plus dermis, the combination of two, is also varies according to the site. So, like all epithelia, ang stratified squamous epidermis also have this, they call the distinction between thick and thin skin. So, as I've said earlier, diba, ang aton nga skin is divided into 3 layers. First one, the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous layer. The epidermis is the outermost, or the, let's say, the outermost or the upper portion, and the dermis would have 2 layers, which is the papillary layer on the left side. There would be a left side representation, and ang dermis would have the papillary layer and the reticular layer. And down the dermis is the subcutaneous layer, or also known as the hypodermis. So as I mentioned kanina, diba, there is this we've heard it a little earlier, as I have discussed, is the epidermal ridges and the dermal papillae. As I've said earlier, they are interdigitate, which means, they are interdigitate, and that with evaginating to strengthen the adhesion of 2 layers of the epidermis and the dermis. So they are connected because they are the reason for adhesion of the 2 layers, which is ang 2 layers is ang aton nga epidermis and the dermis. So in this representation, you can also see the tactile sensory receptor. As I've mentioned kanina, is that sensory is also part of a specific function of the skin. There would be possible is the artery, the vein, and the areolar connective tissue, the adipose connective tissue, which is present in our subcutaneous layer or on the hypodermis. dermis. From the dermis, the epidermis consists of 4 or 5 layer of keratinocytes or 5 layer in thick skin. First is we have the stratum basale or the basal layer. They are a single layer of basophilic cuboidal or columnar cell on the basement membrane at the dermal epidermal junction. An important feature of all keratinocyte in the stratum basale is the cytoskeletal keratins intermediate filaments about 10 nanometer in the diameter. So, ang aton nga stratum basale, technically are stem cell actively dividing or some newly formed cells become part of the more superficial layers. Next is that stratum spinosum. They are normally the thickest layer, especially in the epidermal ridges, and consist of generally polyhedral cells having central nuclei with nucleoli and cytoplasm actively synthesizing keratins. Some cells may still divide, and this combined zone is sometimes called the stratum germinativum. So the keratin filaments assemble here into microscopically visible bundles called tonofibrils. So sa stratum spinosum, there is the presence of the tonofibrils or the visible bundles which converge and terminate at the numerous desmosome holding the cell layers together. They are spinosum, which means ang cell naga-contain sang thick bundles of intermediate filaments made of pre-keratin. Third is the stratum granulosum. Stratum granulosum or also known as the granular layer. So, they consist of 3 to 5 layers of flattened cells now undergoing the terminal differentiation process of keratinization, where their cytoplasm is filled with intensely basophilic masses called the keratohyalin granules, and these are dense, membrane-bound masses of filaggrin and other proteins associated with the keratins of tonofibrils, linking them further into large cytoplasmic structures. The characteristic features in cells of the granular layer also include the Golgi-derived lamellar granules. So, ang atong stratum granulosum in where cells are flattened, organelles are deteriorating, cytoplasm is full of granules. Later on, there would be a representation of this. Fourth is the stratum lucidum. So stratum lucidum, they are found only in thick skin. Consists of a thin translucent layer of flattened eosinophilic keratinocytes held together by a desmosomes. Nuclei and organelles have been lost, and the cytoplasm consists almost exclusively of packed keratin filaments embedded in an electron-dense matrix. Last one is the stratum corneum, where they consist of 15 to 20 layers of squamous keratinized cells filled with a birefringent filamentous keratins. These fully keratinized or cornified cells, called the squames, are continuously shed at the epidermal surface as the desmosomes and lipid-rich cell envelopes break down. So, ang aton nga stratum corneum are where cells are dead, flat membranous sacs filled with keratin, glycolipids, and extracellular space make skin water resistant. So, medical application. First, we have sa medical application the friction blisters. We are all familiar that may mga medical application with skin that might affect or might present a disease or medical importance. First is the friction blisters. Friction blisters are lymph-filled sacs created between the epidermis and the dermis of thick skin by excessive rubbing, as with ill-fitting shoes or hard use of the hands. If continued, such activity produces protective thickening and hardening of the outer cornified epidermal layers seen are corns or calluses. So, pag possible dira is because of excessive rubbing, ill-fitting shoes, or hard use of the hands. This medical application or the friction blisters are between or spaces created between sa aton nga epidermis and the dermis, which there are lymph filled spaces. So such confirmed they are seen as corns or calluses. Number 2 medical application is that in adults, 1/3 of all cancer originate in the skin. So there are also skin cancers. So most of this derive from cells of the basal or spinous layers, producing respectively basal cell carcinomas and squamous cell carcinomas. Fortunately, both types of tumors can be diagnosed and excised early and consequently are rarely lethal. Skin cancer shows an increased incidence in fair-skinned individuals residing in a region with high amounts of solar radiation. Medical application 3. So in chronic skin condition called psoriasis, keratocytes are typically produced and differentiate at accelerated rates, causing at least slight thickening of the epidermal layers and increased keratinization and desquamation. Psoriasis is caused by overactive T lymphocyte triggering an autoimmune reaction in the skin, which can also lead to inflammation with redness, irritation, itching, and scaling with a defective skin barrier. So, we are going to tackle about the melanocyte. This is just an overview because later on as we go deeper, it will be explained later on through the further slides. So, melanocyte. As I've said earlier, our melanocyte is As I've said earlier, the melanocyte they are called the pigment-producing epidermal cell types. Therefore, the color of the skin is the result of several factors, and the most important of which are the keratinocytes, which is the content of melanin and carotene, and the number of blood vessels in the dermis. So, this representation, you can see the melanocytes and the melanin. Eumelanins are brown or black pigments produced by a melanocyte or a specialized cell of the epidermis through among the cells of the basal layer and in hair follicles. The similar pigment found in red hair is called pheomelanin. Phios, dusky, plus melas, black. So there is a step in melanin synthesis where magcatalyze by a tyrosinase or a transmembrane enzymes in the Golgi-derived vesicles. Ang tyrosinase activity mag-convert ng tyrosine into the 3 to 4 dihydroxyphenylalanine or the DOPA, which is then further transformed and polymerized into the different forms of melanin. Ang melanin pigment is linked to a matrix of structural proteins and accumulates in the vessels, which will until they form mature elliptical granules about 1 nanometer long called the melanosomes. So, one melanocyte plus the keratinocyte into which it transfers melanosomes make up an epidermal melanin unit. So, that's melanocyte. As I've said earlier, this is just an overview or an introductory part of melanocytes. Next, so melanocytes. So here are the layers of the skin, the 3 layers of the skin. We have the epidermis, As I've said earlier, I have discussed earlier the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale. So the stratum corneum, in description, they are the most superficial layer, which are 20 to 30 layers of dead flattened anucleate keratin filled keratinocytes protects against friction and water loss. The stratum lucidum is 2 to 3 layers of anucleate dead cells seen only in thick skin. So stratum lucidum again is seen only in thick skin. Next is the stratum granulosum, where 3 to 5 layers of the keratinocytes with distinct keratohyalin granules. Next is the stratum spinosum, where are several layers of keratinocyte all joined by desmosome, or the Langerhans cells is present. Next is the stratum basale. Stratum basale is the deepest single layer of cuboidal to low columnar cells, and the contact with basement membrane mitosis occurs here, and melanocyte and Merkel cells also. So next layer is the dermal skin. As I've tackled earlier, ang dermis have two layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. So papillary layer and the reticular layer, the papillary layer is the more superficial layer of dermis, which composed of areolar connective tissue, forms dermal papillae, and contains subpapillary vascular plexus. Next is ang reticular layer. They are the deeper layer of dermis, dense irregular connective tissue surrounding hair follicles, sebaceous glands and sweat glands, nerves, and deep plexus of blood vessels extending into the subcutaneous layer. Subcutaneous layer, they have no specific layer, but they are not considered part of the integument. Deep to dermis composed of areolar and adipose connective tissue. Next, we also have the medical application number 4. Albinism. I am presenting to you possible skin diseases. Next is the albinism, or it is a congenital disorder producing skin hypopigmentation. Diba? I said earlier, hypo means under. Due to a defect in tyrosinase or some other component of the melanin-producing pathway. An acquired condition called vitiligo involves skin depigmentation, often only in affected patches due to the loss or decreased activity of melanocytes. The cause of melanocytes loss are not clear, but they may include environmental, genetic, or autoimmune conditions. Next is melanocytes. Medical application 5, where melanocytes can normally proliferate in skin to produce moles or benign melanocytic nevi of various types. Changes in the size or appearance of moles are sometimes indicative of dysplasia that can progress further to malignant melanoma, where dividing rapidly malignantly transformed melanocytes often penetrate the basal lamina, enter the dermis, and metastasize by invading blood and lymphatic vessels. Next would be the Langerhans cells. So, Langerhans cells are also known as the antigen-presenting cells, which derive from monocytes, where they represent a 2% to 8% of the cells in the epidermis and are usually most clearly seen in the spinous layer. Langerhans cells bind, process, and present antigens to T lymphocytes in the same manner as immune dendritic cells in other organs. They are, along with more scattered epidermal lymphocytes and other APCs, or the antigen-presenting cells, in the dermis comprise a major component of the skin's adaptive immunity. So antigen, what is an antigen? They are possible for immunity. So, ang ating nga Langerhans cells is a major component of the skin's adaptive immunity. From the word itself, antigen-presenting cells ang Langerhans cells. Various epidermal features participate in both innate and adaptive immunity. So I've said earlier, Langerhans cells is present through the immunity of our skin, providing an important immunologic component to the skin's overall protective function. Next is the Merkel cells. So, Merkel cells or epithelial tactile cells are low threshold mechanoreceptors essential for sensing gentle touch. So, if we heard the epithelial tactile cells, which means they are essential for sensing and touch. They are abundant in highly sensitive skin, like that of fingertips and that basis of some hair follicles, joined by desmosome to keratinocytes of the basal epidermal layer, presenting in both thick and thin skin. Merkel cell resembles the surrounding keratinocytes, with which they share a stem cell origin but contain few, if any, melanosomes. Instead, they are characterized by small Golgi-derived dense core granules concentrated in areas near the basolateral surface where the cells have synaptic contacts with the expanded terminal disc of unmyelinated afferent fibers penetrating the basal lamina. So those three, the the Langerhans cells, the Merkel cells, and the other one that we have discussed earlier is that the melanocytes, they are also known as the less abundant epidermal cell types. As I have discussed earlier, they are just introductory because later on this topic, they will be further discussed. So parang this Merkel cells, the melanocyte, and the Langerhans cells, they are just introductory or a definition lang of what are they. So always remember that the melanocytes, they are the pigment producing epidermal cell type. When we say Langerhans cells, they are the antigen presenting epidermal cell types. And when we say Merkel cells, they are the tactile epithelial cells. Melanocyte, pigment producing, black or brown color of our skin. Langerhans cells, antigen presenting, immunity of the skin. Tactile epithelial, which is sensing, essential for sensing gentle touch, and tactile epithelial cell, sense of touch. So medical application of Merkel cells are of clinical importance because Merkel cells carcinomas, though uncommon, are very aggressive and difficult to treat. Merkel cells carcinoma is 40 times less common than malignant melanoma but has twice the mortality of that disease. So, parang clinical importance siya, although uncommon, but they have to be looked well. With that being said, I will give the floor to my co-reporter. She will report the remaining topics, and which they will go deeper with what I have discussed as an introductory part of my report or of our report, the skin.